Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. Today's guest says it's time to stop worrying about climate change. Instead, we need to brace for impact because global crisis is no longer avoidable. Paul Gilding believes this great disruption started in 2008 with spiking food and oil prices and melting ice caps. And it's not simply about fossil fuels and carbon footprints. We have come to the end of economic growth, version 1.0, a world economy that's been based on consumption and waste, and where we live beyond the means of our planet's ecosystems and resources. According to Gilding, the coming decades will see loss, suffering, and conflict as our planetary overdraft is paid. However, they will also bring out the best humanity can offer: compassion, innovation, resilience, and adaptability. Gilding says we must fight and win what he calls the 1-degree war to prevent catastrophic warming of the Earth. He believes the crisis offers us a chance to replace our addiction to growth with an ethic of sustainability and an unmatched business opportunity as old industries collapse and new companies reshape our economy. In the aftermath of the Great Disruption, we will measure growth not by quantity of stuff, but by quality of life. Paul Gilding is an independent writer, advisor, and advocate for action on climate change and sustainability. He's been involved with and led activist campaigns on a wide variety of social and environmental issues. He served as executive director of Greenpeace Australia and Greenpeace International. He founded Ecos Corporation in 1995, consulting to some of the world's largest corporations on issues of sustainability until its sale in 2008. His first book is The Great Disruption: Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. Welcome, Paul Gilding.
G'day, Terrence. Good to be here.
Okay, obviously, the Aussie. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So could you briefly, I've laid it out somewhat, but could you briefly talk about your path to the work that you're doing today? And feel free to cite mentors, turning points, moments of decision, your personal story.
Okay. Well, look, I started as an activist really very young at high school, age 14, 15, got involved in a variety of issues and went on from there through 15, 18 years of traditional activism on human rights, social issues, a variety of questions, starting out more on the human social side than the environmental side. And then through the kind of late 70s, early 80s, got more involved in the kind of anti-nuclear weapons, anti-nuclear war movement. And that led to a greater understanding of the environmental issues, which then led to Greenpeace and sort of very focused direct action campaigns against corporate pollution. I ended up being head of Greenpeace International. I ran the organisation worldwide out of Amsterdam. And then left there in the mid-90s, really focused on the role of markets and companies and business and how, or could we, I guess is the question, could we mobilise the power of markets as a force for good in this area? And then for the next 15 years, focusing on that question, working in the corporate sector, running 2 companies that I built, and really trying to see, can you kind of drive change through business from the point of view of their self-interest, on recognising that business is driven by making money and that's their kind of core metric. Is that an angle, I guess, which you could drive change in that way? And so I spent a long time doing that. And then kind of about 4 or 5 years ago, reflecting on all of that, came to the conclusion that we left it too late, that we really had done our best in the environmental and social change movements, but the reality was that the ecological and system pressures that we had sort of brought to bear on the global ecosystem were now kind of in full flight, if you like, and therefore the change was going to be unstoppable from there on. So in that kind of personal story process, I guess the critical thing for me is always being open to new ideas, looking around at people from all walks of life, so not seeing myself as kind of NGO or business or academic or whatever, but trying all those different things out and trying all the time not to get ideological or get caught up in sort of my own beliefs too much, therefore being open to persuasion, discussion, debate and confrontation myself with my ideas to make sure I was doing all I could do, the best I could do in that process.
Okay, and one thing I believe you left out was you even spent some time in the military.
Yeah, no, I did. In the early days, I got an interesting story. Went from being an activist on human rights and social issues and labour rights issues into the Australian military and the Australian Air Force. And then while I was in the Air Force, became involved in anti-nuclear weapons activism And I had this very bizarre kind of period at one stage of my life where I was serving in the Australian military, literally Monday to Friday, and then my weekends were spent involved in protests against visiting nuclear-armed warships from the US. So it was a very unusual step for a serving member of the Australian military.
Yeah, but what it does is, though, it kind of fills out that thing, as you say, of you've played so many roles and looked at things from so many points of view that hopefully that means you're not schizophrenic. It means you've got a good take on things.
I hope so, and I tried really hard to do that. It was very deliberate, and partly coming from always meeting new people, different people in different walks of life, and trying to understand where they were coming from, rather than sort of taking a predetermined view. And I see, people are good and bad. People behave well. People behave badly. But I don't see any consistent pattern about people doing that behaviour because they're in the NGO community or because they're in business or because they're in government. I just think people are people, and therefore we should try and be open to persuading people from all walks of life. And that doesn't mean all people are good. It doesn't mean we don't confront and get angry about bad behaviour. It doesn't mean we're not really focused on confronting that at various times. But it does mean we're kind of open to persuasion and listening to different points of view and making sure that we're not caught up in our own belief system too much. And the reason that's important to me is because my life is about driving change. My life is about influencing the world, and therefore I want to maximise that influence, not just feel good about my personal opinions.
Right, exactly. And to actually, since it takes many, many millions of people to change,
exactly,
you've got to connect with them at a level in which they're willing to be moved by you. Now, before we jump into the book and the present, I ran across a commencement address that you gave at the University of Technology, Sydney in 2006, in which you featured on your website. And you laid out your philosophy, which I think is, again, a good place to start. Now, I don't want to force you to remember the 6 points you made. I try that with interview guests sometimes, and of course, I've got the paper in front of me, they don't. So, number 1, we are slightly evolved monkeys. What did you mean by that?
Look, I think it's, again, recognising where we've come from and where we're at as humans. And that there is certain behaviours that we look around, people behaving badly, and say, oh, that's a bad person, that's an evil person. And my point about that we're slightly evolved monkeys is to kind of give ourselves some space, I guess, and some credit for what we have achieved. That we are in a process of becoming human, I would say, and becoming civilised, as opposed to already being there. And that we have certain behaviours, violence towards others, dominating other people, looking after ourselves and so on, which comes from this kind of animalistic behaviour. And we have to recognise that we are, trying to civilise ourselves. We're trying to move up the evolutionary change in terms of consciousness as well as physically. And that we have rules and we have laws and we have cultural mores that guide us in that process. And we have to give ourselves some context, I guess, for our decisions and where we are. That's, for example, why regulation is important, because people don't always behave well and need to have their behaviour, brought to bear. That's why we make, murder by anyone other than the state illegal. It's why we have controls on a whole range of behaviours that we think are dangerous to other people. And that's a good thing, and we need to have that. Otherwise we would, too many of us do behave badly. But we do recognise that, I guess, giving ourselves a bit of comfort that we're still in that process, and therefore we can now move up more. We can now move up that evolutionary chain further, and that we can consciously and deliberately decide to behave a different way, and that's another step on that evolutionary process.
Very good. And I know you don't need to speak about it, but I know that one of the books that you say was very influential to you is The Third Chimpanzee by Jared Diamond.
Yeah, very, very important book in my view.
Yeah, and it's not one of his most well-known. Number 2 in this commencement address of your philosophy is ideology is a cancer.
Yeah, this really gets to that issue about, my life leading me into very many different places in society and recognising that human behaviour can be good, can be bad, but it's not about where you fit in organisational terms. And that ideology is when, people, and I've absolutely confessed to being like this myself at many times in my life, when you're so convinced you're right and you're so convinced you have the answer that it becomes kind of a almost religious one true path and everyone else is wrong. And that to me is dangerous. That to me is, very risky for social change activists to have that level of conviction that everything you believe is right and therefore the other guys, the bad guys, are all wrong. And people sometimes misinterpret this as being somehow weak or not being determined about what we're trying to achieve. And I point to kind of Nelson Mandela as a sort of someone I certainly hold up in great esteem as a person who had this quality, who could be very strong and very firm about what he opposed and what he stood for, take a very hard line in his opposition to what was wrong, and yet try to engage people at the human level and to recognise that we we can be firm in our views without being dismissive of other people and without personalising that into them being sort of somehow evil or bad people compared to ourselves. And that's where I think the ideology as a cancer, I think, is a really critical issue.
Yeah, the other piece I would think goes in there is that if you're a fundamentalist of any sort, where you have the answers, you are less able to learn.
Correct.
And since we are slightly evolved monkeys, learning is essential. Number 3, the system is a mirror. Focus on the behavior, not the institution.
Yeah, this is where, people really don't like this one often, because it's like we like to criticise the world around us, and goodness knows I spend my whole life criticising the world around me, so I get that process. But ultimately, this is a human system. That we create the markets and the consumption and the businesses that are around us. We create the governments that we so often, get frustrated by. And that when I say the system is a mirror, I guess it's both accepting a bit of responsibility for how things are, but also, therefore, it's an empowering idea because we also recognise we can change that we can change the kind of governments we have, and we can change the sort of businesses we have. We can choose to do that collectively as a society. And therefore, it is not just, accepting that we are part of the problem. It's also recognising that we are all of the solution, that we can change the system from the ground up if we choose to do so. And we have that power, and therefore we shouldn't kind of be victims, if you like, of the overwhelming nature of the system.
Very good. Number 4, attacking others mobilizes emotion, but also creates resistance.
Yeah, this is a really hard one because I still do this attacking others' business, and it's good because it makes you feel good, eh? I mean, if you make someone else the devil, the evil kind of person involved in the problem of the issue, then you feel better about yourself, and that's a natural human response, and we all kind of fall for that. And look, there's a role for that demonising of the bad guys. We all have our thing we can't let go of. Mine's ExxonMobil. I can never forgive them for the damage they've done to the climate science debate over many, many years.
Right.
But, you've got to recognise that in that process, you do create resistance. And therefore, you've got to be quite clever and quite smart about how you confront it. So the way I describe this is like, let's think about this as a children issue. We've got to attack the behaviour, not the child. And likewise, I'm still, very strongly opposed to what the coal industry is doing around the world. I think it is going to be seen effectively, as a war crime in hindsight, when we see that, hundreds of millions of people can die as a result of climate change, and it's going to create enormous economic and social disruption. That's going to be a very serious problem. We'll look back on in very harsh terms about that industry. But that doesn't mean the people who work in it are somehow evil or bad. They just want jobs. They're companies that are running themselves the best they can, and we have to confront, again, the behaviour without making it personal. And that's where I think we have to differentiate between the individual and the behaviour that they're undertaking.
Very good. That's the voice of Paul Gilding, author of The Great Disruption. You can learn more about his work and actually see this commencement address that we're going through right here at paulgilding, GILDING.com. Okay, number 5, act with good intent.
Look, this is like a daily kind of ritual for me to ask myself, why am I doing what I'm doing in my work? Is it really for the greater good? Is it partly about massaging my own ego? Is it because it'll make me feel somehow superior? Is it because or other way around, am I being lazy? Am I working hard enough? Am I doing the right things? And the question I ask myself is, what is the intent behind my actions? Am I putting the right intent out there? Because I do believe that if you do that, both in a kind of spiritual way, but also in a very logical, analytical way, if you're acting with the right intention, if you really believe that what you're doing is for the greater good, is for the good of the world, and is the most important thing you can be doing right now in terms of your purpose, then that is a powerful driver, and will ensure that you don't get too far off the track in terms of ego or in terms of other kind of emotional reactions to things. And that, therefore, I think intent is a very powerful kind of touchstone for me in all of my work.
Very good. And the 6th one is, fun is great, but pursue happiness, not distraction.
Yeah, this is this one is really, I think, very topical today when we're kind of going through what are seen to be bad economic times, and we forget just how good most of our lives are in the Western countries in particular, and that we kind of and the consumerism, which is the driver behind and the result of our kind of crazy market society and its obsession with consumption, is by and large distraction, and isn't improving. It's not improving the quality of life for most people. The reality is the things that do make us happy, the things that do give us a sense of satisfaction in our lives when we reflect on our progress, are things that don't come from money. They're things that come from things like community, or from learning new things, or from helping other people. These are what the social sciences tell us creates a greater level of happiness and social cohesion. And yet those things are not what the market is driven by, and therefore we have to recognise that don't fall for those simple distractions or that what we see as entertainment. Look for that deeper sense of satisfaction, but also recognise that fun is good. I mean, nothing wrong with having a good time. There's nothing wrong with having a laugh. There's nothing wrong with being distracted from life sometimes. That entertainment, plays a role, but it's not a meaning of life. And that we should have a good time, we should enjoy our lives, we should lighten up a bit, but we should recognise that has to come from a deeper source of happiness, not from a kind of artificial distraction of consumerism.
Very good. That's the words of Paul Gilding. Here's a little challenging thing. I don't want us to cover the same road again, but I want, if you could, if there's anything you've left out about what you learned at Greenpeace and what you learned in your consulting to corporations that we may have left out and that serves you now.
Look, I guess the big thing I've learned from all that work, and isn't captured by those previous comments, is that we're all part of the system that is driving the problem and the solution. And therefore, I don't judge harshly people who choose to work in any particular sector or do any particular work, because as long as you're trying to make the world a better place, as long as you're part of the movement towards a solution, then you're on the right side of history. And that, I think, is really important to me now. Even though I've now chosen not to do so much work in the corporate sector, for example, I have great respect for people who are trying to do that work. Even though I'm not currently working in a kind of Greenpeace activist-style way, I recognise they're part of the solution. And so as opposed to sort of judging these things as good or bad, or NGOs are too radical, or corporations are too money-focused, whatever it is, I guess it's recognising that this is a hell of a complicated system, and nobody knows how it works. No one really knows how to change it. And therefore, as long as you're doing good, as long as your intentions are right, then I think you should recognise that we're all moving in the right way and focus on the good outcomes, focus on the good progress, rather than criticising others who aren't doing it the right way.
Very good. I'm Terence McNally. I'm speaking with Paul Gilding, author of The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring an End to Shopping and the Birth of a New World. You can learn more at paulgilding, GILDING.com. This past February at the annual TED conference that takes place here in Long Beach, California, and I've long recommended its famous 18-minute TED Talks. Check out TED.com/talks. They cover a wide range of topics, including science, technology, design, business, global issues. And I think they have recurring themes of inspiration, challenge, and optimism. Well, on opening day this year, TED scheduled 2 talks, one right after the other. Yours, Paul Gilding, was the first, entitled The Earth is Full, and asked questions like, have we used up all our resources? Have we filled up all the livable space on Earth? And you suggested we have, with the possibility of devastating consequences. Now, you were followed by Peter Diamandis, head of the X Prize Foundation and author of Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think. And Peter has been a guest on this show since the TED Talk, the TED conference this year. Now, it seemed to me that TED was sort of positioning you as opposing views, or at least yin and yang. And while I can see the differences between your perspectives, especially about the past or the diagnosis, but it seemed to me you both were absolutely in agreement that now is the time for huge advances. Your assessment of that day, the juxtaposition of your talks, and the audience and web response to what went on.
Yeah, look, it was quite an event, because this is sort of the techno-optimist heaven, if you like.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of society, the people who go to the TED conference are great believers in technology and dramatic change, which I am as well, I should point out. But there is this sort of undercurrent of kind of skepticism about people who talk about the problems as though technology can fix everything. And that's really why I was brought in by the TED organisers to confront that point of view, and I certainly did that. And it led to a great debate that carried on all week at the conference between those points of view. And in many ways they appear to be very similar, because I'm certainly a great advocate for technology. I'm very excited about the solar industry right now, which is really taking off around the world and dramatically reducing prices and rolling out at an incredible rate of growth. But there is this sort of naivety, I think, amongst the technology community in some sectors of it that actually believe, therefore, we won't have a problem. They have this sort of underlying belief, and this is, I guess, the only place where I disagree with Peter Diamandis, who I am largely in agreement with, by the way, but This is one area we disagree, is that, I think there will be a crisis. I think there will be, major economic dislocation in this process, and then we will achieve extraordinary technology change, and then we will achieve extraordinary social change, but not until the crisis really starts to take hold, and that's where I think that what I call the techno-optimist view of the world is that, there really is no crisis, there really is no problem that technology can't fix. And that's sort of true over time, but there are consequences in the meantime. So if we have a major ecological economic crisis, for example, then people will suffer. There will be consequences. There will be refugees. There will be countries that it's very difficult to live in. There will be food crises and so on. So technology will come to the rescue in a way as part of the solution, but behaviour change, different economic models, different approaches to doing business, these are equally an important part of the equation, and therefore I kind of put technology into a basket of the solutions that we'll see, and I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride. I think it's going to be a pretty rough ride, frankly, as we move between these eras.
Right. I'm going to just read one of your quotes from your TED Talk. Things will get ugly, and it will happen soon, certainly in our lifetime, but we are more than capable of getting through everything that's coming. And let me just ask you, you say we are more than capable of getting through, but aren't millions of us going to suffer and die early on the way to we coming through that?
I think so, and I think the we really refers to we as the collective civilization of humanity, and that people will suffer, and not just in developing countries, by the way. I think there is going to be a lot of dislocation in Western countries. I think I always say, a bit simplistically, if the world, gets into a very difficult state, if systems break down, if services aren't provided, if we have a global food crisis, or extreme weather, where would you rather be, with the hill tribes of Thailand or the streets of New Orleans? And what I mean by that is that, people in developing countries who are very poor, living in, I don't mean the kind of extreme poverty on the point of starvation, but the kind of the billions who live in very poor conditions but are relatively self-sufficient. Right. They're used to not having any support. They're used to the government not providing any services. That's They're used to having to produce their own food. So they're kind of, in many ways, in a more resilient position than those of us in the West, who depend upon the supermarket shelves being full, who depend upon having a job, who depend upon the government being there to maintain security. So we are kind of I just think it's more complex than the rich will be okay and the poor will suffer. I think it's more divergent than that in terms of who does suffer in crises that are coming towards us.
To some extent, you're talking about the people who are off the grid. You have people in developed countries who are talking about wanting to get off the grid. Yeah. There are still people, millions in the world, billions perhaps, who are off the grid already. And let me just mention one book that, if you're not aware of it, I recommend, and it's Paradise in a Place Called Hell. Do you know this book?
No, I don't.
Okay. Rebecca Solnit. Mm-hmm. And what it is she looked at what happened in New Orleans after Katrina and saw that rather than people turning ugly, that in fact they sort of came together. Mm-hmm. And then she said, well, that's interesting. She looked at 1906 earthquake in San Francisco and found the same thing. So she then examined 6 different cases where places have been hit by enormous disasters, and finds that the sort of what we see on the news, which is, oh my God, looting and, and the degradation of civilization, that in fact, pushed to the wall, people turn around and find compassion and find cooperation. And in fact, that supports what you're going for in your whole book. Look,
I don't know that book, but I'm going to read it because I very strongly believe that. I've written about this myself, is that, to simplify things, it's like with humans, when things are going well, we behave badly. When things are going badly, we behave well. And so we look around at this sort of selfish consumer society we sometimes see today and think that humans are somehow, the lesser for it. The reality is that when crises hit, when we are up against the wall, we come together. And we come together very effectively and very quickly, and our altruism comes to the fore. And as you say from those examples, this is a very consistent pattern. during war, during natural disasters, the tsunami in Japan most recently, a nuclear disaster brought out the best in the Japanese people. I mean, we are very, very capable of turning disaster around as a species. And that's not just good luck. That's actually an evolutionary tendency.
Absolutely.
Because if we didn't have that, those disasters would have brought us down as a civilization. That's why we have survived and flourished, is because things get tough, we look after each other. And that's why, in a funny kind of way, my sort of pessimistic view about the coming crisis is an optimistic view about the future of humanity, because the bigger the crisis, the better we behave. Now, not universally, of course. There was some bad behaviour in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Of course, there is always some looting and people behaving very badly for a variety of reasons. But on average, we come together. On average, we come to the fore and we behave well and help each other to succeed and to survive and to flourish in that circumstance. And that's why I think the coming crisis will see. As I said at the end of the TED Talk, this could be our finest hour for our generation, because the opportunity is going to be so great to turn things around, and that's the history of humanity, that we tend to do so in that circumstance.
Absolutely. So to get now a little bit to your the findings of why the Earth is full, why we have reached our limits, you focus attention on the findings of the Global Footprint Network that and they basically have found that at this point we need about 1.5 Earths to sustain our current global economy. Who are they? What does that mean? And how did they arrive at that figure?
Yeah, this is a really very interesting bit of work done by some very eminent scientists, organised around an NGO called the Global Footprint Network. And just search for that. You'll soon find their website that shows their scientific advisory board and their methodology in great detail. But to very simply summarise that, what they worked out was how much land area would we need to sustain this economy. So how much forest would we need to grow, for example, to absorb the CO2? How much land area of ocean do we need, to support this level of fisheries? How much land do we need to filter the water that we use? How much land do we need for growing the food, and so on? And they translated all of our kind of economic system needs, if you like, into land area. And their conclusion was, versus the available land, obviously land that's suitable for those purposes, we're running at about 50% past capacity. Now, that's one methodology. The interesting thing here is that everyone who looks at it from any methodology comes to the same conclusion, which is that our current economic model is not sustainable in a physical sense. And it's important here to differentiate it from being not sustainable because it's not nice or because it's not fair or because it's bad for polar bears.
Right.
What we're saying here is it's not sustainable in a physical sense of supply of resources. Now, what that means, of course, is not that it's falling apart today completely, but it means we're using up our capital. So if, for example, that land area of soil is not strong enough to sustain the current food production, it means the soil is being degraded. So the soil, we're still producing food. We're not running out of food yet because we're degrading aquifers. We're depleting water supply. We're depleting the quality of our soil and so on, and we're polluting the air with CO2 and other gases. So the essence of the problem here is that whether it's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, whether it's the Stockholm Resilience Centre's work on planetary boundaries, whether it's the Nicholas Stern report on climate change, whether it's the Global Footprint Network, everybody who looks at the whole global system comes to the same conclusion that we're not behaving sustainably. And that's what the underlying position we're in today is, that we're using up resources faster than the Earth can provide them to sustain this economy.
Right, and I'd recommend two others, which is World Watch and Lester Brown's organization, Earth Policy Institute.
Yep.
Both of those, wonderful material on this issue. And let me just add, you point out that it's not just that we have to figure out how to deal with using 150% of Earth's capacity, but that between population growth and economic growth, that is, billions rising out of dire poverty, that we're aiming to multiply that number, already 1.5 times what the Earth can supply. We're aiming to multiply that, given our current trajectory, by 2, 4, or 6 times.
Correct, and this is where the sort of maths becomes, unarguable in my view. That you can argue that we can maintain for a while using up more resources that we can provide because technology will make that easier and so on over time. But the simple maths of 3.5% growth per year, which is what the forecast is generally into the long term globally, 3.5% growth, remembering that China is growing at 8 or 9%, that means that we go from an economy this size to an economy 4 times this size by 2050, right? So if you start off at 1.5 times, even allowing for improvements in efficiency and renewable energy and a whole range of ways that we can improve our economy in terms of resource consumption, we're looking at needing 3 Earths or 4 Earths by the time we get to 2050. And my point is not that that's unpleasant, not that it's bad for biodiversity, which it certainly is. My point is it's not possible, that there won't be enough resources for the economy to grow that much, and therefore the economy won't grow that much. And that is actually a very big social crisis, because our economic system depends upon that growth to sustain employment, to sustain social stability and so on. And that's why we have to recognise we have not just an environmental problem, we have a fundamental human problem here, that our society is inherently unstable in this context.
In your subtitle, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World, and yet I see over and over again that what you're really talking about is not just the climate crisis, but it's the entire system. It's an integrated system that is falling apart. And here's my question. 1, why did you choose that? But 2, doesn't it seem that there are some people who might not react as much to climate change because it's just nothing that's real to them? But if you told them, look, the system is breaking down, oil prices have shot through the roof, food prices have led to uprisings in countries and so on. The Eurozone, which was looking like the best thing going, is in grave danger, et cetera, that more people might be reached by this notion that the system is broken down than that it's climate change. Your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, go back to that great political slogan, it's the economy, stupid. People respond to the economy. People respond when their personal economic situation either looks bad or is looking at risk. And we're very focused on that personal impact, the hip pocket. The way we respond when the economy goes bad is we throw out governments, we change the approach and so on. So the essence of my message is that, don't worry about climate change. What I mean by that is, not that it's not a problem, but that it's the economic impact of the system breaking down, which is what will get our attention. And the good news in that is that we'll get our attention and we'll change, but the bad news in that is it is going to hit us economically before we respond. And that's why issues like food supply, you refer to Lester Brown's excellent work at the Earth Policy Institute, the food supply is under threat. The water supply is under threat in many countries. The food supply and the water supply problems means that we're having social problems like Chinese companies and government instrumentalities moving into other countries buying up farmland. This sort of economic stress on the system is what is going to come home to roost soon in terms of its impact. And, the crisis in Europe, the US debt crisis and so on, these things are all part of the same system problem, that we are so desperate for more growth. We are so desperate to get the economy moving further ahead in terms of its consumption of resources that we borrow from the future to get it to happen today. And there's some great work done by Richard Heinberg, who wrote a very important book recently called The End of Growth, who talked about the fact that, the reality is the economic growth we're getting today in most Western countries is actually not real growth. It's actually debt that government has borrowed from our children and is spending today to keep economies growing, which is not really growth. That's not really kind of progress. That just means we're borrowing from the future financially as well as ecologically as well as resources, and that's why it is a system problem, and that's why it will get our attention in that way, but not until we try everything we can to get the old system to work harder.
Very good. Heinberg has also been a guest in the show numerous times, and folks, if you want to find a Richard Heinberg podcast on the end of growth, go to the website. If you want to find Mathis Wackernagel and the Ecological Footprint Network, that's also back there. One thing that I find provocative is you compare our response to climate change to our response to Hitler. A highly provocative comparison, I know, because I've mentioned it to friends who react rather strongly. Explain why you think that's a fair comparison.
Look, I think there are very few other examples in history where we have genuinely felt sort of existentially threatened, that we really believe that everything we stood for was under threat. And Hitler was one of those. So, from a social perspective, from the point of view of freedom, the point of view of basic morality and ethics, everything Hitler stood for confronted the very essence of our beliefs. And therefore, whatever it took was the answer in terms of how much we're prepared to expend our energy, our finances, and our mental and physical and organisational capacities in response, whatever it took. And climate change and the broader issues around resource constraint and this economic model are going to be the same, because we are facing what is absolutely an existential threat to our civilization. There are many forecasts in this area that show if we don't address climate change very, very strongly, if we don't get the food supply system under control and working for us, if we don't stop consuming resources at this rate, that we are facing a genuine collapse of civilization. I don't mean by that the end of humanity as a species, but I certainly mean the end of civilization as we know it and a breakdown of society and a long, sustained period of what Kunstler calls the long emergency. So these sort of ideas, I think, are important to compare historically. When else have we felt that threatened? When else have we felt that everything we stood for was under threat? And the answer is Hitler. The answer is World War II. And therefore, the mobilisation that we now need to take in response is comparable. And unfortunately, same as Hitler, we won't respond until the crisis is so in our face it's undeniable. But the good news is when we do respond, it will be on a comparable scale, and it will be seen like a war in terms of our level of industrial and social mobilisation in response.
Yeah, two things I want to say. One is that I think that point that you make, which is that the evidence for climate change has been accumulating. It is irrefutable, and yet we are still in some over some great expanse of society in some stage of denial.
Yeah.
And that with Hitler, although people now, this many years, with that in the past, think, oh, we turned on him and we took him down. What you point out is that his actions prior to Pearl Harbor or prior to, were enough that you knew the evidence had accumulated, but there was denial because, as you say, in that case, it was a second world war.
Yeah.
Which the U.S. and any country that could avoid it wanted to avoid, just as in this case, the choice seems negative. The choice of slowing down and turning back growth seems negative. So there's this accumulation of denial, and then when it pops, the hopeful sign is how quickly it popped. Lester Brown has been making that point in his Plan B books for years, that if we can equal the mobilization we did in World War II, we can make significant progress fast.
Correct. And then that's another comparison there, of course, is that in World War II, Hitler was in Europe. Yes, the US was giving some support to the UK and others in that process, but it was a European issue. The US wasn't getting involved. Likewise, on climate change, we see the US taking a backroom role and not getting as active as the US needs to be on this issue. And hopefully, the comparison will carry on.
Right.
And the US will be like the great mobilising power when we do get to work in this area. And that's a big question in my mind. Is the US likely to come on board at that scale? Because there's no one questions the ability of the United States society to mobilise when it gets its act together in this regard. And the famous quote from Winston Churchill, which, one of my favourites in this area, the US can always be relied upon to do the right thing after it's exhausted all other possibilities.
Right.
And that is the issue we're hoping for here, is that the technology revolution that we need, the social revolution in terms of change, the financial power that we need to be addressed to this issue, will be led by the US in this process. And frankly, if it doesn't happen, then I think it is the decline of the US as a world power, because the future is now so clear and China and others are moving ahead on it so fast that I think, we are certainly at that sort of very special moment now in history when big decisions are being made that will have an impact for, a good century to come.
You're from Australia. From your outside perspective, Paul Gilding, why does it look like the U.S. seems slower to move to clean energy in the kind of forceful way, for instance, that Germany or China have?
Look, I think what it is, and we have a bit of this behaviour in Australia as well, so I guess I recognise it from that, that the US is so addicted to oil, is so addicted to coal and fossil fuels and to cheap energy, that when you're very heavily addicted to something, denial becomes stronger. And that I think the change that is needed in the US is kind of greater than the change that's needed elsewhere, because the per capita CO2 emissions, just on a very numerical basis, are higher than they are almost anywhere in the world, apart from Australia, it should be pointed out, and therefore the change is bigger. So when that change is bigger, when that impact is greater, when what happens is denial gets stronger. And you see this with an alcoholic, or you see it with a number of different comparisons of addiction, that when people change, they change dramatically and towards the end of the process when the consequences are getting very severe. And that's what I think is happening in America today, is that the denial has become so extreme and frankly quite laughable in some of the political manifestations of that, so ridiculous and so anti-science, that I think we are going to see a change happen very quickly here when it does happen. But of course, the more extreme the denial gets, the harder it is to overcome that, but then the faster it breaks down when it does occur. And again, referring back to World War II, I always think of what Churchill must have thought in the mid-30s when it was so clear to him that the science was in, if you like, in comparable terms on Hitler and the threat that he posed, and yet society was in denial. There was no commensurate response, even in Europe at that stage, to the level of threat. But when the change occurred, boy, did things get moving very quickly as a result.
Okay, I'm Terence McNally speaking with Paul Gilding about his book, The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. And despite much of what we've been saying, but I think you can hear it threaded throughout, there is an optimistic upside to this as we speak about human resilience and human society's ability to respond once it gets over its denial. Let me ask you one other question about, again, your outsider perspective on the U.S. system. Many, myself included, believe that the U.S. system of politics and government has really changed over the past few decades. Nixon, a Republican, for instance, signed the bill creating the EPA. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing would seem impossible today. From your outsider perspective, what does it look like has happened, and how much tougher does that make our challenge?
Look, I think what's basically happened, and the central issue in the US is actually inequality in terms of political power, in terms of financial benefit and so on. There has been this very great concentration of wealth and power in a small number of people. And that's not inherently, structurally imposed by democracy. It's just the way it's turned out in terms of the development of this society. There was a kind of greater sense of responsibility to the greater good, I guess. We have many great Republicans in history in the US who took actions, as you refer to with Nixon, the Clean Air Act and so on, who did the right thing because it was the right thing to do, even though some people suffered consequences, whereas now that sort of behaviour is not as strong. And, I've many friends who are Republicans who sort of lament that change. Mm-hmm. So it's not a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's actually a cultural issue, I think, inside the society and inside the Republican Party to some extent, which has driven that process. But it is eminently changeable. And the point here is that politics is, as Al Gore says, a renewable resource, and that we can see politics change very fast. And we saw, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I thought was one of the most interesting things to happen in the US for a very long time, that, we do see the politics change. We do see the attitudes of the public change, and that can change very rapidly, as a bunch of leaders in the Middle East have learned recently, as they've been toppled from office by social movements that have come up apparently from nowhere, but have apparently been building for a long time underneath. And we saw that with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we do see change happen at a political level rapidly in many parts of the world, and I think we'll see it change here in the US as well. And I think that's where I have a lot of hope that the US still has an opportunity to lead change in this area and do so quite dramatically. And even though we don't see those signals today, I do think that this is a country that went from George Bush to Barack Obama. I mean, the capacity for change is quite extraordinary. And yes, many have been disappointed with how much Barack Obama hasn't achieved compared to the hope, but the capacity of the people to demand change, I think, is as strong as it ever was. And you have to have the right sort of constellation of forces to be happening at the right time, and I think that will occur.
Okay, yeah. My next question was going to be about Occupy and the 99% movement. I'm just going to read one quote in something you wrote. You said, Occupy Wall Street is simply the kid in the fairy tale saying what everyone knows but has until now been afraid to say. The emperor has no clothes. We have system failure. Let me ask you, the hopeful part is based on, first, you do, and here, if you can deal with this briefly, you deal sort of with the social psychology of this. That is, how society will transform through denial, anger, finally to acceptance, and to this turnabout once the acceptance of the reality is there. Do you want to speak at all about that?
Look, I do, because I think we kind of get caught up in, as we have in this conversation, with the fascination with, correctly in my view, with the size of the crisis and the complexity of the problem and the fact that we have system failure. But that can be kind of paralysing if you don't immediately move on, as we are right now, to the fact that humans are very good in a crisis. As we discussed earlier, when things go bad, we go well. And that kind of human attribute, I think, comes to the fore. And we have seen in many situations, both at a personal level, at a company level, at a family level, at a societal level, at a global level, when we get focused, we achieve extraordinary things very quickly. And in technology, in human behaviour change, World War II again, many good examples of that, numerous natural disasters, fires and floods. We just do things that are kind of beyond our comprehension, and we do them very easily. And that's how I think it will be in this case. And it's not like just a hopeful thinking or wish it was that way. I think it's rooted in this historical evidence of how humans behave and how societies behave. And that's why I am fundamentally very optimistic that once the crisis is understood and accepted, once we recognise we do face this sort of existential threat to our civilisation and our society, we will achieve extraordinary things and will certainly solve the problem. And we'll address the causes, and we'll do that with amazing capacity and incredible creativity. And we'll look back on it and wonder, of course, why we didn't do it earlier, but nevertheless we'll still be able to do it, and therefore we will come out of this in better shape as a society, nevertheless, with the consequences of damage on the way through, but we will get there, I think, as a result.
Right. Well, I'm going to read another quote here. Hope is a stance. It's a belief system I choose to work within because it's more effective. It makes me feel better. And most importantly, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela did not win their particular movements by advocating despair. You say that the most important issue we actually face is how we respond to the disruption when the denial breaks. Do we respond with despair or with hope? Hope for what? Someone asked me that last night.
Yeah, no, good question. And it's hope for the sort of capacity of humans to respond as much as we need to achieve the objective. So I guess the reason I'm saying that is so important in this case is that if, when we face a crisis, we revert to fear, if we kind of hide in ourselves, in our lives, in our families, in our societies, in our countries, that will lead to nationalism, to breakdown, to dog-eat-dog sort of response. And many people fear that. I don't think there's evidence in history to suggest that is the dominant response. I think it is a response that does occur. But I think the dominant response is one of self-protection, but at a large scale, and acting for the greater good, which is obviously, part of this issue is having good leadership at that time. But part of hope, therefore, is actually the belief that we can do that. If we believe that we're capable of that level of turnaround, if we believe that humans are capable of acting together for the greater good, if we believe that we're capable of having the technological transformation that we need to have to, for example, eliminate fossil fuels, and we can do that relatively quickly, then we'll do it. So the belief is actually a very important part of the process. As we mentioned before, Nelson Mandela didn't argue an impossible task that they might succeed on. The ANC slogan was freedom in our lifetime, a very tangible, direct goal. The whole process of the civil rights movement, it was about, I have a dream, right? It wasn't, I have a nightmare, we might get past it. It was, I believe in this possibility. And so that whole belief system, political leadership, belief in hope and so on is a crucial part of the social movement that we now need to build to get ready for the moment that I see coming.
Okay, now let's, we've got about 6 minutes left. What I want you to do right now is very briefly, and I'm sure you've practiced at this, what does the 1% war look like? This is the shift, the technological shift, if you will, and the behavioral shift that helps us solve this problem.
Yeah, look, it briefly starts in climate change science. What the climate scientists tell us is that 2 degrees of warming, is the line where we get out of control, that the temperature increase causes, catastrophic system breakdown, and that a 1 degree level of warming, a 1 degree above pre-industrial averages, is a level that we can cope with. It still has bad consequences, but we can actually cope with that as a society. We're not at risk of sort of system breakdown. And so the 1 degree war plan was a plan that I put together with Jørgen Randers from Norway, one of the authors of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report in 1972. We worked with the MIT system modelers and said, how would you achieve that? What does 1 degree of warming look like, and what would it take? And the answer was, in the title, a war plan. It requires a warlike mobilisation. And you'd be amazed, we were amazed, frankly, how fast and how cheaply we could achieve that level of change, given the dislocation that would otherwise be caused. And the answer is that we could, for example, eliminate CO2 emissions from the economy on a net basis within 20 years. We could transform that society in the first 5 years by halving the climate emissions. So it just sort of reinforced strongly that we are capable of doing that. It does require sacrifice. It does require, for example, rationing and price imposition and controls on the production and so on. But that, as we saw in World War II, can be done and can be managed if we do it the right way with the right level of political support. So it just completely reinforced to us that the task before us of stabilising the global climate, to keeping warming, getting it down to 1 degree after it goes over that point for a short time in this process. Now, these are goals, the 350 movement, for example, is arguing for. These are goals that are achievable, that do not require any new technology, do not require any new breakthroughs in anything apart from our thinking, frankly, and that we can then achieve these goals, and we can do that in sufficient time to stabilise society and therefore to have a healthy future for our civilization.
And so if you want to see, because we've glossed over a bit the actual what that's going to take, it is in the book, The Great Disruption. It's the steps. It's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's how it can be done and how it actually looks, and that it is practical. Finally, giving you again about another 3 minutes. The second part of the subtitle, which is A Better World, you seem to hinge that on, one, that this is going to be an enormous opportunity for innovation, and that more stuff actually does not make us happier. And so a shift to happiness based not on more stuff, but on a quality of life is a real goal for all of us. Can you speak a bit about the positive sides of this?
Really, really important research in recent years showing that societies with greater inequality are actually unhappier societies and have bad social outcomes that actually make them not good places to live, even for the richest sort of people in that society.
Yes,
which is, I think, very important.
Yeah, let me just cut in. The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett is the book that really lays that out. Really clearly.
And what that says is that we're all worse off if we're not equal. I don't mean equal as in literally equal, but if we're too unequal, if we're too extreme, then we all suffer. And likewise with consumerism, that once you get to a certain point of your basic needs being met, that more stuff doesn't make us happier. I don't say that as a philosophy. I say that as a measurement, that what the social scientists are saying is that once you get your basic needs met, you work harder, you get more money, you have more money in the bank, you buy more stuff, you have a bigger house. Your average quality of life in our society does not improve any further. And therefore the system that we're seeing breaking down isn't working for us anyway. So the simple steps we need to take, we need to make our societies more equal, we need to have greater opportunity for the poorer, right? And we need to have the rich recognise that more money doesn't actually improve their lives. And therefore we need to do that. We need to recognise that less consumption, spending more time on community, more time on helping each other, more time on learning, more time on being involved in our society and our community. These are the issues that actually make us have a better quality of life, make us have safer lives, have more secure lives, and have better lives. And that's therefore the kind of only solution we have to where we need to go in our society actually makes us better off. And that's why I'd argue that the crisis that's coming will lead to a better world than the one we have today.
And I'm just going to follow up on that. You mentioned Schumpeter and the idea of creative destruction, and that creative destruction is usually thought of that there's economic destruction or a corporation goes down because it's the old guard, not the new guard. But I think what's implicit in what you're saying is that creative destruction applies to society as well, and that this model that we have lived under, it will be destroyed and there will be pain, but that the shift is actually to where we can go as a species.
And I would add to that, like it's to think of it in terms of it's a higher evolution of consciousness as well. That we recognise that where we're going in this place is a continual part, as we have had since we were monkeys, right, to evolve to a better, more civilised, a nicer place to live for humans is the path that we're still on. And that's why I think we should recognise this is not just defending something, we're actually building something here in this process.
That's right. Okay, again, the book is The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. You can learn more at paulgilding, Gilding.com. Finally, thank you to Paul Gilding, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.